Hello Octoprint fans, Former Lurker here. Today I'm going to show you how to configure a Raspberry Pi camera and how to enable custom image preferences within Octolapse. Now these are going to let you edit the Raspberry Pi camera configuration, things like contrast, bitrate, exposure, and white balance. Not focus though. The Raspberry Pi camera does not have any automatic focus, so unfortunately you're still going to have to edit that one manually. But we're going to walk through all the options that you have available to you. So the first step, let's find the Octolapse wiki page. And if you search for Octolapse and GitHub, this should be the first link. It'll take you right here to the repository homepage. And then you want to find the wiki link right here. Then scroll down a little bit and you can find Enable Custom Image Preferences under the guides. If you click on that link, it will take you to this page. Now first, you're going to want to make sure that you have Octolapse version 0.4 installed at least. If not, take a look at this Getting Started guide. Go ahead and follow that, and actually that's going to have the steps necessary to configure your Raspberry Pi camera in there, or links to it at least. So once you hit that section, you can start this video back up. Okay, so first of all, there's a couple prerequisites. In order to get this working, you have to be running mjpeg streamer, and that fortunately is installed by default if you're using Octopi. And there's a lot of guides out there. Most of them involve using mjpeg streamer as your streaming server. If you're using some other streaming server or an IP camera, unfortunately this probably isn't going to work for you. And there's also a couple plugins, Octoprint Anywhere and the Spaghetti Detective. These are great. These are great plugins. But unfortunately they have their own streaming server that does not support the custom image preferences, so only mjpeg streamer is going to work. Okay, so once you've read through the prerequisites, there's this notes for Raspberry Pi cam users, and then there's a link to the guide for getting that set up. So let's go ahead and click on that. And I cover a lot of the same things in this guide, so the prerequisites, all that. So the first thing you're going to want to do is connect your Raspberry Pi. If you follow the Getting Started guide, you've probably seen that, but if you click this link, looks like that link's broken. I'm going to fix that, but there is a guide for connecting via PuTTY, and that's what I'm going to use. So let's switch here, and this is PuTTY. I've already got it set up. Basically, you just make sure you're using port 22, and you're connecting via SSH. You want to enter your IP address here. I've already created a profile that has all that stuff configured, so I'm just going to use it. And then you're going to have to log in. So I'm going to use the Pi user, and then I'm going to copy my password. And if you click in PuTTY and right click, it'll paste whatever's in the clipboard. In this case, I had my password in there. You can't see it, and that's for security reasons, but if you hit enter, you'll see that it did paste it in and it logs in correctly. Okay, let's go back to the guide. So it says the first thing to do is upgrade our Raspberry Pi software, and you can do that by entering in this command, sudo apt-get update. So I'm going to copy that back into my terminal, paste that in, and this could take a while. It's going to ask me for my password. It may or may not do this. It depends what other things you've done in your terminal, but if it does, just copy your password in, right click, just like we did earlier, and it should start looking for updates. Now I just ran this update a few minutes ago, so hopefully it doesn't take very long. Yes, it's finished. Okay, so it didn't really update anything, which it probably is going to. So this may take 10-15 minutes, so grab a snack, wait for that to finish. Okay, now the next update we're going to do is we're going to update the distribution, and that's this command right here. Copy that, go back in your terminal. This one will take even longer if there's updates. So we're going to hit it in there. It may ask for your password. Enter that if it does. And fortunately, since I just ran it today, there's nothing more to update. Now these updates aren't going to take effect until you reboot. So if you go to the wiki, I've got the command here, sudo reboot. You can copy that in. Go back to your terminal, paste it, hit enter. It'll reboot. Your PuTTY terminal will disconnect. You got to open a new window to reconnect, or you can right click on it and there's a, I think there will be a restart session or something if it if it disconnects. But I'm not going to actually reboot because that takes too long. So let me clear. So let's just assume that, you know, I rebooted and now I'm finally reconnected to my Pi. Let's go back to the wiki. And the first thing we want to do is edit the Octopietxt file. There's some settings in there that are going to control access to some MJPEG streamer functionality, as well as what kind of camera is going to get initialized. So we have to make some changes there, and that's located in the boot/octopi.txt folder. So we copy that whole thing, and we go back to the terminal, paste it in there, and we're going to run this command as the administrator because this file already exists. And it may ask you for your password. If it does, just go ahead and enter it, and then it'll open the nano editor and you'll see the text right here. So if we go back to the wiki, it says the first thing to change is this camera. You see how by default it's going to be set to auto. It may be set to Raspberry. It all depends how you've configured your camera previously, but we want to find that camera section and make sure if there's a pound symbol in front of it, that, like, excuse me, right here, that you delete that, because that means the line is a comment, and if there's a pound in front of it, it won't look at that command at all. So I'm going to copy this out of here, switch back to the terminal. I'm going to find that camera setting right here. I'm going to erase it all the way to the beginning, right click, make sure there's no pound there in the front. We have it set to USB, and that's right. So let's go back to the wiki, scroll down a little bit. The next thing we want to do is go all the way to the bottom of this file and find these two lines here. They probably look like this, and I copied that text out here. Notice they have these pound symbols at the beginning. This means that they're comments, and these are the default settings, so there's no reason to actually enter those. You want to change those lines to this. And this does something, and you got to kind of understand what it does. It opens up your Raspberry Pi and allows the MJPEG streamer web pages to be loaded. Now this used to be the default in Octopi, but at some point they decided that they wanted to disable these pages by default because some people have their Octoprint instance exposed to the internet, like they use port forwarding. Now you should not be doing that. You should be using VPN or some other plugin or program to connect to your Octoprint instance through the internet. As long as you're not, using port forwarding, this is actually pretty safe. But if you are, it means anyone out there on the internet can find your camera and change the settings. So make sure you understand that before you do this. So I'm going to copy these out, switch back to my terminal. I'm going to use page down to go to the very bottom. Then I'm going to erase these two lines. You see they start with these pound symbols. It means they're comments. Now I'm going to right click, paste those two lines in there. And again, they're not commented out. Excuse me. Now go back to the wiki, and there's one more suggestion here. You might as well adjust your camera resolution and frame rate as long as you have this open. Now, this particular setting here will set your Raspberry Pi camera to run at 1080p at 30 frames a second. Now, 30 frames a second might be a little bit high for you, especially if you're running your Raspberry Pi over Wi-Fi. If you are, I recommend something lower, maybe 15 frames a second, maybe even a little bit lower than that. But the higher your frame rate is here, the less time it will take to capture snapshots. So you want to turn it up as high as possible. And also you might want to be aware that some browsers actually have problems displaying MJPEG streams at a high frame rate. So Firefox, for me, has a problem. It gets really sluggish. Sometimes it even locks up if I'm running at 30 frames a second. It seems to be fine at 15, but Chrome doesn't care if I use 30 frames a second, so I'm going to use that. Okay, we're going to copy that in. We're going to switch back to our terminal. We're going to find that setting, and it might be commented out. You see right here, this is commented out. So I'm just going to delete this line. You don't have to delete it. You could paste it underneath, but I like to keep things clean. So there we go. Now we're set at 30 frames per second at 1080p. And to save this, I'm going to hold down Control, press O, and we've told it what file we're editing, and it's just asking us if we're sure we want to save it as that same file name. So I'm going to hit Enter to confirm. Then to exit, you can hit hold down Control, press X. Now we're out. Okay, so let's go back to the wiki. Now the next step is to edit the modules file and add the Raspberry Pi camera driver. So this is one of the reasons we updated earlier to make sure that this driver gets installed. And I've heard rumors that a new driver is going to be added soon. If it has the same name as this driver, which I'm not sure, then just updating your Raspberry Pi should pull in the new driver. If it doesn't, I'll probably add some notes here. So keep an eye on this. And I'm not sure if this works for the new high-res Raspberry Pi camera. So if anyone follows this guide and they're using the new high-res camera and it works, or it doesn't work, I'd appreciate it if you let me know. Unless I have added a note here, because then I already know. Okay. So now we're going to edit the modules file, and you can do that. This is how we're going to add this driver. You can do that by copying this line and then switching over your terminal, paste that in. It may ask you again to enter your password. It didn't for me. So go down here to this last line and then go back to the wiki, and you'll see that you should add this text, and make sure you get the first B and the last two there and copy it. Switch back to the terminal and paste it in. Now we want to save this. So I'm going to do Control O to output, and we're going to save it to the modules file. And we're going to do Control X to exit. Okay, so that's it for the terminal, except one last thing. We have to reboot, otherwise this driver won't be loaded. So sudo reboot, and then hit enter. I'm not going to do that because actually, believe it or not, my driver's already loaded. But let's assume I did reboot, and I've waited for the Raspberry Pi to reboot, and Octoprint has come back up. So let's switch over to Octoprint. Okay, so we're going to add a profile for my Raspberry Pi camera, and you can do that by clicking this cameras link right here, and then click Add Profile. And you can type the name of your camera. There we go. And it's a webcam, so make sure that's selected in the camera type. It should be. And in general, if you only have one camera installed and it's set up in Octoprint, this section will already be configured for you. It's going to pull out the base address. This is the address that the camera server is actually running on. And this snapshot URL right here, this is a special little command, and it explains it here, and also there's a help link that explains what that does, but basically it just replaces whatever is in this box with this. So this and this, these are equivalent. And then down here is the streaming address. Typically, you would run this like this, and this would work. This is a relative URL, so whatever you type into your browser, it would attach /webcam and this to it. But I'm going to use I know what the values are for my camera, and I've got a couple cameras running at the same time, so yours probably won't look like this. If you run into trouble here, click these help links, and there's actually a troubleshooting section in the wiki. You scroll up here, troubleshooting. If you open that, scroll down to cameras, there's some stuff here, and I'm going to add some more links as I discover problems and common fixes, and I'm going to add them in here or to the specific camera troubleshooting guide. All right, so let's go back to our wiki. That is here. I should have navigated away from it. All right, added a profile. Great. So once you've got this all configured, click your test webcam button. It should give you success. If you have errors, again, follow the troubleshooting guide. And this, you can just copy this URL. If it's a relative URL, you're going to have to put in the IP address of your camera at the beginning of it. So, whoops, I don't know why that was weird. Let's copy that out. This should work. I must have not actually copied it. So that looks a little bit messed up, right? Well, I'll show you why, and I'm going to show you how to fix it. This is kind of common for the Raspberry Pi cameras. They're a little finicky. They don't always do exactly what you expect. Honestly, I recommend USB webcams. They're just a little bit easier to use, but we're going to get this to work. So we've entered the stream URL, and now the only thing we have to do is enable custom image preferences. So if we click this box, Octolapse is going to run some tests on your camera. It's going to try to make sure it's running MJPEG Streamer, and it's going to make sure that it has access to a couple files and some web pages that it needs to get to in order to set these. And if it works, you'll see a couple new settings. If it doesn't work, you'll see an error message. So I'm going to click it, and I get the new settings. So in my case, it worked. I didn't have any error pop-ups, so great. So custom image preferences are enabled, and I'm going to go ahead and save that. So now you're going to see your new profile right here, Raspberry Pi camera, or whatever you called it. It's going to show up. If I close the settings, you're going to see the new camera listed in your cameras in the Octolapse tab under the current run configuration, and make sure it's enabled. By default it will be, but if you click on it by accident, it may disable itself. And then here in the time-lapse preview, if you select in this drop-down box your Raspberry Pi camera, you may notice there's no buttons over here. But since you enabled custom image preferences for this camera and you select it, you'll get an edit pin. When you click it, it'll open a new page, and it shows your camera stream and a bunch of settings. And it should say that it's detected a Raspberry Pi camera module. It may not have the exact version here, but what Octolapse does to detect your camera is it has a library of cameras that it knows about. And if all the controls are the same, it considers them pretty much the same camera. Now, if you're running a newer Raspberry Pi module and it's not detected, you're going to see something more like this. This is the default view for unknown cameras. And basically, Octolapse is going to take a list of the controls that your camera says that it supports, and it's going to turn those into controls. And it knows a lot. Like, it knows the minimum possible values for the controls, the maximum, and the step. Like, you'll notice here I can change these in increments of 2. Well, that's what the Raspberry Pi camera supports. So if you can't select an option, it's probably because your camera doesn't support it. You can also switch to a single column layout. That makes it a little bit easier to adjust these sliders, or the dual column, or if you want, you can, and your camera is supported by Octolapse with a custom page. If you click here, you get a little bit nicer controls, and there's some validation and some other nice things. So the very first thing you're going to want to adjust is the bitrate. The default bitrate for the Raspberry Pi camera is pretty low. So crank that up. Look at that. Immediate improvement in quality. And that was the default. That's pretty scary. So all the way down, it's crap. All the way up, it's good. So very first thing, adjust that bitrate. Now you probably want to adjust your focus. So as you can see, my camera is not really aiming at my print. It's actually aiming underneath my bed. And that's because I broke my camera mount, unfortunately. So I don't have enough room to get it high enough. So maybe I'll remake this video and put a different image in there. But I think this is adequate enough for you to see what's going on. Now there's some settings in here that you're going to want to set to manual. Obviously we adjusted our bitrate. We turned that all the way up. But we're also going to want to adjust our red-blue balance. Now I'm going to give you a little warning. The current Raspberry Pi camera module, once you change this to manual, it won't change back, at least not without a reboot. So you have to put this back to auto, and then you have to reboot your Raspberry Pi, not just Octoprint, your whole Raspberry Pi, to get it to turn back to auto. So that's unfortunate, but can't do anything about it. So let's pick manual. Things look kind of crappy, and these aren't so easy to adjust. So the idea is, you turn this up, it increases the blue. You turn it down, it decreases it. Same here, red, it cranks up the red, it cranks down the red. So you want to find the balance of red and blue that make the colors in your image appear as true to life as possible. Now, why might you not want this to be automatic? Well, in automatic settings, if the lighting levels or if the colors that the camera sees change during the print, it's going to adjust them. And you might think that's good, but that won't be consistent from snapshot to snapshot. And then when you get your final time lapse, it's going to look like it flickers a little bit, or it's not perfectly smooth. So setting this to auto, even though it takes a little bit of time to figure out what the colors are supposed to be, 100% worth it. Do it every time. The next setting you're going to want to look at is exposure. And in order to get exposure working, you may see some of these controls are disabled. And if you change some of these, other ones get disabled if you're using the custom page. But for the Raspberry Pi camera, make sure scene is set to none. Make sure auto exposure mode is set to manual. And now that unlocks this. And I've got, a lot and none. And another quirk I've noticed about the Raspberry Pi camera, like you may see the exposure increasing, and then after a certain point it stops increasing. I don't know why that is. That seems very strange to me, but that's just the way it works. And it could be that MJPEG Streamer is not reporting the right maximum value for this exposure time, but that's what it's reporting right now. So hopefully with some future update that works. And you want this exposure time as low as you can get it while your image is still bright, as bright as you want. So I'd recommend increasing the lighting on your print. Use way more than you need, and then turn your exposure down as low as you can. That'll prevent motion blur. It'll actually increase the speed a little bit, depending on some things. It'll decrease how long it takes to acquire an image. You might also want to check the power line frequency. For example, if you're on American power, we operate here at 60 Hertz. If you're in the United States, we use 60 Hertz. That's our power line frequency. And depending on what your frequency is, you may get some like jittery looking images because of the frequency from the lighting that's around. And this will tell your camera to adjust for that. Now, I've not noticed any difference personally, so probably it's because of my lights. So I just disable that. But if you notice some flicker and you've got manual settings for everything else, you may want to give that a try and see what happens. So I'm going to save that. And then I'm going to come back into this and I'm going to show you some other cool features. So this button, Stabilize Extruder, what this is meant to do is help you focus. So you don't know where your bed's going to be when you take a snapshot. And to illustrate this, unfortunately, I'm going to switch to my other camera. It's got custom image preferences enabled, and you can actually see the bed. Now, I'm also going to pick the back center to stabilize to, and I'm going to make sure that I'm not using one of these snap to print triggers. I'm going to use this smart compatibility trigger. If you use snap to print, because Octolapse doesn't know where your bed and your extruder is going to be, you're not going to be able to stabilize it in those custom image preferences. I may change that behavior in the future, but for now, set it to smart compatibility. And it also won't be able to do it if stabilization is disabled. So make sure you have not, disabled your stabilizations. Let's go in here. Now I can see my bed. If I hit Stabilize Extruder, it's asking me to make sure that the bed's empty, because when I hit OK here, it's going to home the X-axis, it's going to home the Y-axis, and then it's going to move into the stabilization position. So if something's on your bed, some printed part or a tool or something, it'll run right into it. You don't want that. So let's hit OK. You can see it's homing X, now it's homing Y, and now it's going to go to the back center. Great. So now that it's in position, and you can change the position that it will stabilize to just by picking another profile, or you can edit the profile and choose from one of the available profiles on the server. So I'm going to go back to the Raspberry Pi camera. All right, so I know this isn't like a great image. I'm going to make another video about how to get the settings tuned in, but the main thing, bitrate maxed, manual white balance, get that working, manual exposure, and then you can come up here and adjust the brightness or the saturation. I find like kicking up the saturation a little bit is usually kind of nice. Brightness, I mean, that it all depends on your taste. Contrast, I haven't noticed any difference at all in this JPEG quality slider or this compression quality. I've just not noticed any difference. So if you see one, let me know. And I've not noticed anything There's a lot of these settings that I just don't know what they do. I mean, I know the camera supports them, and I know what values they support, but I don't see any difference, you know, so let me know. I'll update the help files for each of these settings. All right, so now what I would recommend doing is running a test print. So let's turn test mode on. If it's not enabled, you can enable the current run configuration here, make sure it's expanded, find test mode, click on it and make sure it's enabled. And you should see a little message up here telling you the test mode will be activated when the next print starts. And if you hit this question mark, it'll show you some more information about it. Now, test mode prevents your extruder from getting hot, prevents your bed from getting hot, prevents your fans from turning on, and it prevents any extrusion commands from being sent. So you shouldn't extrude any plastic. Now, regardless of that, I recommend that you unload your filament before you start a test mode print. Better safe than sorry. All right, so now I'm going to pick a test file. This is a good one because it's small. It's very fast to print, doesn't take very long. So I'm going to select that. I'm going to hit print, and if you're using one of the smart triggers, you'll get the snapshot plan preview. If you haven't seen this before, definitely follow the getting started guide. It'll familiarize you with all these settings. I'm going to hit accept, and then immediately my printer starts to home. This is going to take a little bit of time, so I'm going to take this time to show you one of the smart trigger features. So if you click on the Octolapse tab again and scroll to the bottom, make sure that current run configuration is expanded, and then make sure this snapshot plan info is enabled. You can disable it if you want. It saves a little bit of bandwidth. But it basically shows you how many G-codes are remaining until the next snapshot's taken, the percentage of the layer, or actually the snapshot progress. So when this hits 100%, it's going to try to take a new snapshot. It shows you where your extruder is going to be when it starts, when it snapshots, when it returns, and it lets you animate those. And up here you can see a little icon indicating that it's taken a picture, and then boom, we get our first snapshot. Now you can hit this button and see a larger version of the image. And see, it's not great. There's my hot end, my bed's down here, but again, it's because my camera mount's broken. Now, what I would recommend is that you run a couple layers, get 2-4 snapshots taken. And by the way, I've got 2 webcams enabled, so this is actually 2 snapshots per camera right now. Once you have at least 2, you can cancel, and Octolapse will try to render a video. But let it go for a little while. Cancel it when you've got enough frames, that you think you can see what's going on. Then Octolapse will start rendering. And when it's completed, which takes a little while, you can go into these videos and images, and you can download the time lapse, and then you can take a look at it and see how it looked. So if you don't like what you see, if it's jerky, if it's blurry, if the image quality is not good, if the color's off, if it flickers, then just come back in here, pick your camera, your Raspberry Pi camera, hit the edit pin, adjust your camera settings, move your camera around, adjust your lighting, make sure you got really bright lights. You want really bright lights on your camera. And repeat this procedure, make sure it's in test mode, run another print, until you get a nice short little time lapse that's really smooth, that's not jerky. You may even have to edit your camera profile and change your snapshot delay. I've actually noticed that 60 works better for me, but if you have a jerky time lapse, you may want to increase it. But click on this help. It explains some important things about snapshot delay and how to get it right. And then once you're happy with what you're getting, disable test mode and print something for real. I mean, you can print the test cube and see how it actually looks. You can print another print. I wouldn't recommend at this point printing something that takes like 3 days, because you really don't have a lot of experience with that profile to know that it's going to work over that period. So you may want to run something a little bit safer first. But now that we're done setting up your Raspberry Pi camera, everything should be working. I want to point out a couple links down here at the bottom of the page here on the tab. There's a link to the About page. You'll see a list of all my patrons. Thanks, guys. You'll also see some people who've contributed to Octolapse in the past, including Gina, the creator of Octoprint itself. Give her a bunch of love, guys. She's the one that made all this possible. Thanks, Gina. You'll also find a link to my GitHub page. Here you can find all the repositories I've made, including some new goodies like the Arc Welder plugin that's not yet released, and even a library of C++ code for that and some console applications. You'll also find a link to my YouTube channel. That's probably where you found this video. There's also a link to PayPal if you want to send me some, a cup of coffee or a beer. I'd appreciate that. And a link to my Patreon page. So if you want to become a patron, I appreciate that. But Octolapse is open source, so it's free. You're not expected to donate or to give me any money. And also right here, there's a link to the version that you have installed. I'm running a kind of a pre-release-ish version that I've been developing, so my link here will not take me to the release notes, but in general, this will take you to the release notes. This one's going to take me to the commit information. So that's it. All right. Hope you enjoyed the guide, and happy octolapsing.